Hi, everybody. My name is Diego. I am the program director for file development here with LAMDL, and today we're going to go over some stock issues. So, now that you're in the novice division, something that is important to talk about is just what constitutes a case argument for the affirmative. All policy affirmatives follow this idea that they meet these requirements for the affirmative, also known as stock issues, and being able to identify each component of what a stock issue is helps you not only be affirmative, defending the affirmative on an adequate level, but it also helps you in being negative as well, being able to identify what are the spots that you need to like deconstruct from the affirmative in order to win the debate. So, stock issues are the core components of the 1AC that are required in order to exist. They're like basically the building blocks of the affirmative. If the affirmative does not have any of these building blocks, it crumbles, it falls apart. As the negative, if you are able to prove that one of these stock issues falls apart, then you win the entire debate. And we can talk about how that works. The reason is because the affirmative has this thing called the burden of proof in response to the resolution. So the resolution says that the U.S. should significantly increase its development exploration in the Arctic. The affirmative has the burden of proof to show that the resolution is desirable. What that means for you whenever your affirmative is that your plan is an example of that resolution. Your plan is an example of the resolution being desirable. In order to fulfill the affirmative's burden of proof, you got to fulfill your stock issues. And we're going to break that down using this acronym called HITS. All right. Let's start with the first S. The first S is significance. The significance is that the harms of the plan are big enough to justify an action. So, an action just being the plan. The plan will have a significant effect on the identified problem. You may be asking yourself what significant effect means or what a significant effect constitutes. That is up to debate. If the affirmative can't prove that their plan is a significant shift from the status quo, then you would vote negative because the affirmative has not met one of the core stock issues in the debate, which is that the plan must have a significant effect on the identified problem. So, for example, let's say the plan is talking about climate change in the Arctic, but they have a plan that only affects maybe 0.05% of the total area that constitutes the Arctic. I don't think that's a pretty significant effect on the identified problem if that's what they're doing. And so they would be in a big trouble there because then the negative can just say that the app is not a significant departure from the status quo from today's world, and that would result in a loss for the affirmative team. With the files, the affirmative has to prove that they have a significant effect in terms of like mining for deep sea minerals for the deep sea mining affirmative, and for the Alaska affirmative for the JV division, the affirmative has to prove that they significantly shift away from the status quo by banning oil. They have to prove that that is a significant shift from the status quo. The second stock issue is harms. Harms just means how big are the affirmative's problems? What's the impact of the 1AC? Who slash what is the problem going to affect? This is usually the reason why affirmative teams like to go to the biggest impact possible, usually culminates in some type of extinction, whether it's through nuclear war, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. Essentially, the affirmative wants to show that they have a big group that is going to be impacted if the plan is not passed, if the problems go unaddressed. If they don't have that, then it's a pretty big chance that the negative can just win on the fact that the affirmative has not met the stock issue. So, for example, let's say the affirmative wrote a plan that only impacted one person in the entire world. Nobody would really care, to be honest. And so that is why the affirmative wants to have a significant harm. You'll see that these stock issues kind of like have interplay with each other, and it's designed that way because the affirmative must meet these in order to fulfill their obligation in the debate. Third stock issue is inherency. Inherency describes what prevents the problem from being solved now. So what is inherent? What is something that is true about the status quo about today that makes action necessary to solve the problem? Usually you want to think of inherency for the affirmative as there is this barrier that is stopping us from being able to solve the problem now. There are three ways to describe inherency. The first one is the most common. The first one is institutional inherency. So institutions are causing the problem or institutions aren't doing enough to solve like a certain situation. So, for example, with deep sea mining, the inherency is that we just are not like mining for deep sea minerals right now. Institutions are not putting forth like the resources necessary or the mining operations necessary to mine for deep sea minerals in the Arctic. In the case of the JV affirmative, uh, the institutions are directly causing the problem because the government is becoming more lenient in granting mining permits in Alaska. And so the institutional inherency for the JV affirmative is literally that institutions are causing the problem. We want that problem to go away. Uh, Second type of inherency is attitudinal inherency. There are social biases or attitudes that are causing the problem. You don't really see these too many because, again, in policy debate, you're focusing on policies, and so you're focused more on institutions and not necessarily what people think. Maybe like it could be attitudinal inherency in the sense that politicians don't want to pass the plan, and so you might be forwarding an affirmative that is really unpopular, like with politicians right now. And so that might be an attitudinal barrier to solving a problem. The third type of inherency is existential. It just means that the lack of something, like the lack of legal protections, is causing the problem. Like it literally doesn't exist. The solution does not exist, and therefore we need to pass the plan in order to like solve whatever problem the app wants to solve for. Again, let's say we flip this around. Let's say the app is not inherent, or yeah, let's say the app is not inherent, that the problem is already being solved now. If that's the case, the affirmative loses every single debate they're in because all the negative has to stand up, all the negative has to do is stand up and say, problem's already being solved now. The plan is not needed. GG's affirmative team. And so that is why it is a third stock issue for the affirmative team. Fourth stock issue is topicality. This one gets its own entire file like in the file sets. Topicality is a question of whether or not the affirmative has met their resolutional obligations. So that's the resolution for you. USFG should significantly increase its exploration and or development of the Arctic. All of these words create a limit for what should be talked about. So topicality is a debate about what the words mean in the resolution. So for example, if I were to ask you the question, whoever's watching this, what does the United States federal government mean? You might define it by the three branches, so like executive, legislative, judicial branches, right? Other people might define it differently, and then that creates like different conditions for what the affirmative can and can't do. Another example is like, let's say we define the Arctic by different geographical regions. There are interpretations of the Arctic that include Alaska. There are interpretations that do not. And depending on that, that influences what you can debate about. If the negative team proves that you are outside the topic, that you are not topical, then you would lose the entire debate because it means that you have talked about things that should not be allowed to be talked about. It's essentially like they would call you out for cheating in that scenario. So all of these words create a limit for what should be talked about. So let's give some examples. The first one, using this resolution, would an affirmative that disarms nuclear weapons be topical? Just like straight up plan was like plan, let's disarm US nuclear weapons? Probably not. I don't think any nuclear weapons are based in Alaska. I don't even think that increases or explores anything in the Arctic. So that would not be topical. If the affirmative introduced that as a plan and the negative read T exploration, T development, T Arctic, like this affirmative would lose because it's not about the topic. Um, Notice how with topicality, you do not have to prove that the affirmative is a bad idea, like in terms of the actual affirmative. You just have to prove that the affirmative should not have been talked about in order to win the debate as the negative. Second example, is banning Arctic oil drilling topical? This deals with the JV affirmative. On face, it sounds like no. Like the resolution says that every time you're AF, you have to increase exploration and or development. Sounds like banning drilling goes in the opposite direction of that. But again, the affirmative can make arguments for why that's not the case or why they are topical. Third example is increasing deep sea mining topical. This one feels topical. Like it feels like, yeah, you're increasing exploration and or development as long as the affirmative has specified in the plan text that this is in the Arctic or yeah, in the Arctic, then it should be fine. Okay. Last stock issue is solvency. In solvency, the affirmative must prove that they can solve the harms of the 1AC. Pretty simple here. Does the plan solve the problems identified? This is the most common way of disproving the affirmative in terms of the stock issues. I see a lot of like no solvency arguments or reasons why the affirmative makes the problem worse through the form of like turn arguments. Most case debates happen at this level. This one's a lot easier to understand. If the negative can prove that the affirmative does not solve their arguments, then they don't meet their stock issue. They don't solve anything, vote negative. Um, so those are the five stock issues. Again, I want to emphasize why you should know this. The first one is you take one stock issue out and it's game over for the entire affirmative. If you can prove that the affirmative is not inherent, not significant, does not solve any of this harms, just one is enough to take out the entire affirmative because it implicates the entire reason why the affirmative was read in the first place. The second thing is that as you move up in the divisions, as you move into the varsity division later on, it is a key blueprint for creating your own 1AC. Um, as long as you're following these five stock issues as requirements, then you should be in on a good trajectory towards creating a good 1AC. And then the third thing is that a good negative strategy requires you to debate the affirmative on all levels. Being able to tackle all of these five stock issues gives you flexibility as a negative, and being able to notice how certain arguments interact with the case is a really good way to revise your negative strategy and make sure you are debating the affirmative on all possible levels. But yeah, those are the five stock issues in debate. What I would suggest is try using this knowledge to break down the evidence sets that LAMDL provides, and then try to notice those patterns across different affirmatives as well. I promise that this will help you deconstruct affirmatives on a deeper level when you're negative. Hope this helped.